everybody, and welcome back to Night Brothers Commentary once again. Today we are going to be talking about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and more specifically, 3 films in the MCU regarding Phase 4, which is basically going to be Doctor Strange, Black Panther, and Thor Love and Thunder. Now, to start off with, Doctor Strange, I actually thought was a pretty decent film, all things considered. So, essentially, the movie basically goes, Doctor Strange kind of meets up with America Chavez after the events of Spider-Man No Way Home. And apparently, the reason why he meets up with her, is basically, Wanda is trying to, essentially, recreate the kids that she had from WandaVision. And, Wanda needs her to basically make that happen. So essentially, Doctor Strange and Wong basically confront Wanda at Camartage, and they basically get separated. Wanda basically takes Wong up to the special dimension where the Scarlet Witch is kind of like the ruler of Mount. I think it's like Mount Wangamore or something like that. Whereas basically Chavez and Doctor Strange kind of get thrown into the multiverse. And eventually they meet up with the Illuminati, which is basically Charles Xavier, that universe's version of Mordo, Agent Carter, who basically got the super serum that Captain America got. Black Bolt, which I thought was really entertaining. It was actually kind of nice just to kind of see the Inhumans represented again. Maria Rambeau is basically this universe's version of Captain Marvel. And Reed Richards. Good lord, was that bad. I don't necessarily disagree with the casting of John Krasinski as Reed Richards, but the way they filmed it and how it just really kind of came out, how it was portrayed in the movie was just bad. Because from what I've read, essentially, no one really interacted with John. John was basically filming his own scenes somewhere else. And everything was just added post production, so it doesn't feel organic at all. It just feels forced. And also, you'd think for a guy like Reed Richards, he would be smart enough not to point out who was probably the most powerful person on that team, i.e. Black Bolt. But anyway, basically Wanda in her Dreamwalker version, where basically she just kind of took over and just basically mind controls that version of herself in that universe. She basically just wipes the floor with the Illuminati, except for Mordo. Mordo is probably the only one that survives in that encounter. But essentially, they basically find, after that encounter, basically Palmer, Chavez, and Strange basically go find the Book of Ashanti, and unfortunately Wanda shows up and destroys it. So, yeah, and she basically captures America Chavez at that point too. So so basically things just go from really bad to basically damn near apocalyptic at that point. Eventually, Doctor Strange basically meets another version of himself, and they basically have a duel, and our main version of Doctor Strange, essentially just destroys, I wouldn't say destroys, he basically beats that evil version of Doctor Strange, and then uses that version of the Darkhold to basically control the version of Doctor Strange that died previously, like in the first couple minutes of the film. So that, and basically he goes off into that dimension to to fight Wanda, and basically, I wouldn't necessarily say that he wins so much as he basically convinces her that that what she was doing was wrong by essentially giving her what she wanted, and then he basically gives her what she wanted by giving her access to another version of her kids that she had from WandaVision, and basically they treat her like absolute crap. And she just kind of realizes the error of her ways and basically destroys that whole building as long as and thus doing so, essentially destroying all versions of the Darkhold throughout the entire multiverse and sacrificing herself in the process. So, yeah. I mean, that's basically the gist of what happens in that movie. And honestly, I thought it was pretty good. I think it holds up relatively well, all things considered. And arguably, I think it's actually the best movie. Well, the best movie. Not. I don't think it's the best movie in Phase 4 so much as I think it's the best out of the three I'm going to be talking today so far. Now, moving on, Thor: Love and Thunder. Man, was I hyped for this one, and boy, did it disappoint. Whew. Good Lord. There were so many jokes in this movie. Like, I mean, I know that's kind of like Takeshi Waititi's thing, but I just feel like, I mean, it just, I mean, it was just too much, honestly. So essentially, the movie basically starts off with Gore, the God Butcher, and his daughter basically kind of struggling to survive in a desert. And apparently, his daughter dies, and the Necro Sword, which is basically his weapon, essentially, like the God-killing sword, basically calls the Gore. He accepts it, and he basically just takes that sword and just kills the god that he was worshiping. And I think he also kills a whole bunch of the other gods in that scene as well. So, yeah. And he essentially just vows to kill all the gods, which, and Christian Bale really nailed it in this movie, I'll be the first to admit. But essentially, kind of moving on, uh, Jane Foster is back in this movie, and basically, as per the comic book thread, she basically she has cancer, and eventually she kind of finds out where that Mjolnir may be able to help cure her disease. So she basically goes to New Asgard, finds the ruins of Mjolnir that was basically destroyed in Thor Ragnarok, and basically due to the spell that Thor accidentally placed on it, she is able to wield Mjolnir. And it reforges and basically just becomes, honestly, like a better version of itself, arguably, in my opinion, now that it can basically split up and just take out multiple enemies at once, which she does to great effect as Mighty Thor in the fight scene where basically Gore's minions basically come and just abduct a whole bunch of kids and just pillage and all that. And Thor, prior to all that, is still kind of with the Guardians at this point. He basically kind of helps, quote unquote, save this planet while also just kind of like destroying a whole bunch of their infrastructure by accident. And eventually, yeah, Thor basically separates from the Guardians of the Galaxy at that point, and he meets up with Sith, who is trying to save another race of people from Gore, I believe. Yeah, and they both of them, as well as Korg. Yeah, Korg. That's his name. Yeah, so basically all three of them kind of return to New Asgard where they meet up with Jane and Valkyrie, who's now basically the Queen of Asgard. And like I said, they basically fight off Gore, who does manage to essentially kind of capture a whole bunch of New Asgardian children and basically takes them to this shadow dimension, if you will, this shadow planet. And eventually, Thor, Valkyrie, Jane, and Korg basically go to the realm of eternity. Sorry, not sorry, not there. Basically, they essentially uh, they essentially go to Olympus, or at least what I want to assume is kind of like basically Marvel's equivalent of Olympus, and they try to convince Zeus to help them out. He says no. They basically start a fight, and Thor basically steals Zeus's lightning bolt and then throws it back at him, almost mortally wounding him. In a post-credit scene, he basically survives and tells his son Hercules to go after Thor. So I'm kind of curious as to where that plotline's going, but eventually they basically do go to the realm of eternity, that dark shadow dimension that I mentioned earlier, and essentially Jane basically sacrifices herself to save the kids by wielding Mjolnir, because sadly, as per the comic book line, as per the comic book storyline, essentially Mjolnir is basically I mean, while she does gain Thor's powers by wielding it, it's also killing her because the chemo. I mean, it's basically just removing all the chemotherapy that's essentially destroying the cancer cells. So it's allowing her. I mean, her using Mjolnir is basically allowing her cancer to grow, and by using Mjolnir, she basically kills herself and essentially goes to Valhalla, where she meets. Essentially, yeah, she basically meets Heimdall. He welcomes her to Valhalla. And I'm just kind of wondering where that plotline is going to go as well. I mean, you wonder if it's going to, like, come back in, like, King Dynasty or, like, maybe Secret Wars. I would say probably King Dynasty, honestly. Because, I mean, I don't know. The way I see it, I think Valhalla is almost kind of like... I want to say it's almost kind of like maybe a quantum realm in a way. I mean, I could be wrong. Maybe it's just like a complete alternate dimension, kind of like what we saw in Moon Knight with basically the Egyptian underworld, the Duat. Oh, anyway, essentially, Thor manages to beat Gore due to Jane's sacrifice, and he decides to basically resurrect Gore's daughter, and she basically raises her as her own. Because, I mean, keep in mind, I mean, Gore was practically going to die anyway, as we later find out throughout the movie, since the Necrosword, while it does give him power, also kind of puts a curse on him to where eventually the wielder of said Necrosword is basically is just going to die eventually. So essentially he basically, I mean, Thor promises to take care of his daughter, which he does, and that's kind of where that movie leaves off. And essentially, I mean, I did enjoy Love and Thunder. I just don't think it was as good as Ragnarok. I mean, if I had to rank all the Thor movies personally, I would say Ragnarok is first. I will probably put Love and Thunder probably second or third alongside the first Thor movie, and Thor: The Dark World is easily the worst. I mean, Thor: The Dark World is easily like the worst out of the Thor movies, in my opinion. But anyway, moving on to Black Panther, Wakanda Forever. This movie This one, I'll admit, was honestly kind of a disappointment. I mean, did I? I mean, I'll admit I enjoyed parts of it, but I do feel like Marvel kind of made a mistake here. Actually, I feel like they made a few mistakes. But essentially, this movie basically starts off with T'Challa basically dying off screen, which sadly is basically just due to Chadwick Boseman dying. May he rest in peace. And they basically have like a traditional African funeral for him, and like a year later, Wakanda is basically dealing with a whole bunch of international pressure due to them not releasing their vibranium to the outside world. And you basically have like a whole bunch of countries, especially the US and I think France. Because, I mean, the reason why I say France is because it seemed like the military unit that attacked that Wakandan outreach facility to try to steal their vibranium was the French Foreign Legion. I mean, I don't know. I was getting a lot of French Foreign Legion vibes from that for some reason. So, anyway, essentially, I mean, you basically have that, and you have Queen Ramonda now, who I'll admit, I kind of wonder why she was able to kind of reclaim the throne for herself after the whole. I mean, I know basically this whole scene where she's kind of like admonishing the UN for not necessarily respecting Wakanda's desire to keep the vibranium for itself. But I know there's like a year gap in between T'Challa's funeral and that scene, and because the whole thing where basically both M'Baku and Killmonger basically challenged T'Challa for the throne in the first one. I mean, you just wonder if they just kind of like, I don't know why. I mean, they kind of made that like a really big deal in the first movies, and just to kind of like gloss over it in this one, it just feels really I don't know. I don't know. It just feels kind of like a slap in the face, honestly. But maybe something jeez, like something similar did happen. Just kind of, but it just kind of like took place in that time gap. So who knows? I mean, it would have been kind of nice just to kind of see Queen Ramonda basically kind of take up that challenge herself against M'Baku and just kind of whoop his butt. That would have been a fun scene. But anyway, essentially, you basically have Shuri just kind of still dealing with the grief of losing her brother, and a lot of her guilt and shame for basically not being able to save him, and despite being probably one of the smartest people in the MCU at this point. Essentially, kind of moving on, basically the CIA and the SEALs essentially find a new cache of vibranium somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, but eventually Namor's people, essentially they're basically like a combination of Atlanteans and Aztecs. And I'm not gonna basically just try to butcher the pronunciation of the name of the place's name, so I'm just gonna call it Marvel's Atlantis. Yeah, so essentially, the Blue Atlanteans, quote unquote, basically they basically just kind of wipe out the CIA Navy SEALs joint operation there, and Namor basically goes out to Wakanda and says, "Hey, yeah, basically the U.S. Are looking for this. They're looking for vibranium in the ocean. I think we should team up." Shuri and Ramonda say no. He's like, okay, but essentially, they're like, okay, but we still want the scientist. Please give us the scientist, and we'll leave you alone. And then, so basically, Shuri and Okoye basically meet this scientist who happens to be Riri Williams, aka Ironheart from the comics. Man, her character did not do it for me, to be honest. I mean, I'll admit, it's probably, I would say her character is, I would say, relatively accurate to the comics. And that's probably why I didn't really like her all that much, because, I mean, she just kind of came off as really kind of arrogant and abrasive in a way. And I don't know, it just didn't really, it didn't feel, I mean, she just didn't feel likable, honestly. So essentially, Okoye, Shuri, and Riri, sorry if I butchered the pronunciation of that. They all try to escape Boston and head off to Wakanda for her personal safety. That basically gets stopped by both the FBI and the Aztec water-breathing people. But yeah, let's just go with that. Yeah, and essentially, they basically they get stopped. Okoye loses her fight, and both Riri and Shuri get captured, and they get brought to the cave. That kind of leads to where that kind of leads to the Aztec Atlantis, if you will. Shuri basically visits the Aztec Atlantis, and essentially she kind of sees that Namor really does kind of have, like, he has a point when it comes to basically trying to help protect his homeland, as he certainly has a right to. But eventually, Okoye essentially loses her position as general, as Queen Ramonda admonishes her for not being able to protect her daughter. And I mean, I'm kind of 50-50 on that whole thing, because like I can understand why. I mean, I'll admit I understand how. I mean, I can respect her feelings at that point, because I mean, losing her daughter not very long after her losing her son and then her husband. I mean, she basically. She just. I mean, it's basically just her lashing out. But on the other hand, I mean, Okoye is a very capable general, is a very capable warrior. So, and it wasn't entirely her fault, you know, because it's like, I don't think the Wakandans have ever faced a culture that another culture that had access to vibranium before. So I mean, it's not entirely her fault too. So I mean, I kind of see it from both angles, if you will. Yeah, but eventually, she Queen Ramonda basically recruits Nakia to come back and rescue Shuri and Riri, which she does. But in doing so, she kills one of the Blue Aztec water people, and that kind of sets Namor off. And Namor basically attacks Wakanda, and this is where I think the movie really kind of made a ballsy move. And I'm not sure I agree with it. I think, I mean, basically, Queen Ramonda dies while trying to save Riri. And now, essentially, Shuri basically is just hell bent on revenge at this point. And they have a second funeral for Queen Ramonda. Now, basically, Shuri is the leader of Wakanda, at least in the interim, in my opinion. And she manages to use the necklace that sorry, not the necklace, the bracelet that Namora gave her, which is essentially just, it was made off of a plant that was essentially affected by vibranium, and she uses that in addition to basically her brother's DNA to create a new version of the heart-shaped herb plant that basically Killmonger destroyed in the first movie. She basically takes the heart-shaped herb, she goes to the ancestral plane, meets Killmonger, who basically just kind of incites her to take revenge. Man, was that scene good. Oh man, Michael B. Jordan as Killmonger. Oh man, did I enjoy that. Anyway, she basically kind of makes her own Black Panther suit, which I'll admit I actually kind of enjoyed. I like that suit. And the reason why I kind of like it is because it really kind of has not only her like her own styling, like her own additions, if you will, especially with the little sonic cannons that she kind of used in the first Black Panther movie. But the suit is really kind of like a combination of Killmonger's suit and her brother's, and that is, at least in my opinion, allegorical for the conflict that's kind of going on inside her. Because in a way, I mean, she does kind of have the nobility and compassion that her brother does, but on the other hand, she's also just kind of like I said, basically just kind of like bent on revenge and just kind of wants to, in Killmonger's words, take care of business. So essentially, she basically kind of lures Namor out for a fight out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, which I personally think was really kind of a dumb move. Like, you basically put the repaired the vibranium finding device that basically Riri essentially made and basically kind of sold off to the CIA, albeit unintentionally, in my opinion. I mean, I think Riri was kind of deceived on that front. But essentially, they basically used that to lure the Namor and his people to come out and fight. Initially, it goes relatively well for the Wakandans, but it eventually the blue Aztec Atlanteans essentially kind of gained the upper hand, especially after they basically damaged the ship. Now, the fight between Shuri and Namor I think, is actually pretty good. I mean, you definitely, I mean, the way I see it, she doesn't necessarily. I don't think she has the same level of combat experience that her brother did. But on the other hand, I mean, she's not entirely naive to combat. I mean, you definitely see that she's really kind of like thinking things out. She basically uses the heaters and the Wakandan jet to kind of weaken him first, which certainly helps. But eventually, she basically kind of gets him onto the beach somewhere. I don't want to say it's relatively close to where that the Wakandan ship was, but essentially, it's close enough. They basically kind of have a fight. He almost kills her, but eventually she manages to basically just kind of recover enough and essentially almost kill him. And she basically, by almost basically trying to burn him alive, and she almost kills him, but eventually she decides to kind of like take the path that her brother did, show him some compassion. And Namor yields. They basically come to a truce. And essentially, I mean, I would say the movie's pretty much over at that point, where basically Riri kind of goes back to MIT while having to leave her new Iron Man-esque suit behind. Okoye basically becomes a Midnight Angel, and honestly, I actually kind of enjoy it. I really do like that suit. Probably, I mean, other people may hate that suit. I actually kind of like it. Essentially, M'Baku essentially kind of steps up the challenge for the throne, and whether or not, I mean, that's definitely an interesting plot point in my opinion, because I'm just kind of wondering if M'Baku is actually going to be taking the throne, because Shuri doesn't show up at all. She basically kind of goes off to Haiti and basically can kind of complete the ritual that her mother was going to try to help her with before Namor showed up in Wakanda. Like he after the Americans basically tried to steal the vibranium from the ocean. And essentially, she learns that that Nakia and her brother basically had a son named Toussaint, while his Wakanda name is basically T'Challa. And I don't know, I actually kind of like the little, I like the reference to the Haitian revolutionary. But essentially, I mean, Namor, I actually kind of liked Namor. I mean, I will admit, I will admit that Namor is, I was kind of getting like a lot of like, how do I phrase this? Namor really kind of seemed like a mixture of Killmonger from the first movie, in addition to, I don't know, kind of like, I want to say like the Aquaman from the Justice League animated series from like the early 2000s, if you will. I mean, I was really kind of like getting vibes from, I was really kind of getting those kind of vibes for some reason, because I mean, it's the way I see it. I mean, that version of Aquaman doesn't necessarily have like a whole bunch of love for the surface world, kind of like Namor in this movie. But you also see that Namor really does kind of have like a legitimate reason to basically protect his kingdom and the vibranium that he has, because he knows that essentially, like if the outside world basically gets access to vibranium, both Wakanda and his and the Aztec Atlantis place, I mean, both of them are basically going to be on the back foot, because the rest of the world is, I mean, for those who have studied history, I mean, especially with regards to the nuclear arms race that happened during the Cold War. I mean, basically, Namor fears that, well, vibranium is basically just going to be like the next arms race, essentially, and he's not wrong. He's not wrong. So, I mean, Namor definitely has a right to try to keep the try to keep both his people and the vibranium he has access to safe. But overall, I do feel like this movie was, shall we say, I don't want to say it was bad, but I don't want to say it was good either. I mean, it certainly wasn't as good as the first Black Panther movie, but I don't think it was as bad as other Marvel films, especially like Thor, The Dark World, or Iron Man 2. I don't think it's on that level per se, but it certainly is one of the weaker Marvel films, in my opinion. I mean, I can understand Marvel not wanting to recast T'Challa, but personally, I mean, after having seen this movie, I feel like they should have. I really feel like they should have recasted Chadwick Boseman. And in a way, they kind of are by having basically Chadwick Boseman T'Challa having a son named T'Challa. I mean that's just. I mean they kind of are. But the way I see it, I do think they kind of messed up by not recasting Chadwick Boseman for this film. So anyway, those are basically the three Marvel movies that I am going to be reviewing in this video. Essentially, I mean, these three movies I think set up a whole lot for for Marvel and for basically phases 5 and 6, because I mean, with the whole I mean, basically Doctor Strange in the Multiverse. I mean, yeah, that basically just kind of opens up a whole can of worms. Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, that is basically just kind of helping set up Captain America: New World Order and the Thunderbolts. If not, also the Secret Wars TV show and Everett Ross is Martin Freeman's character's involvement in that, based on the trailer. And Thor: Love and Thunder, I mean, that one is basically just kind of setting up a whole massive confrontation between Thor and a whole bunch of other gods, especially both Zeus and Hercules. Or I should say Heracles, considering that Hercules is technically the Roman name, while as Heracles is the Greek name. But I digress. I'll say that these three movies are, I mean, they're definitely I would say, I mean, they definitely have their strong points, but they also have a whole bunch of weak points that kind of bring them, that kind of bring the overall quality down, if you will. So, I mean, I'll admit I do have some reservations about the MCU going forward at this point. I do feel like phases 1 through 3, the Infinity Saga, I do feel like those series of films have definitely proven to be a lot better than the Multiverse Saga, which is basically phases 4, 5, and 6 so far. But until then, Night Brothers Commentary, signing out.